The harbor wind carries the scent of brine and burning coal through the cracked window frames of the 1847 boarding house. Shadows stretch long across the uneven floorboards as the last of the daylight surrenders to the oncoming chill. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If slipping into these forgotten corners of the 19th century brings you comfort, the subscribe button will ensure you always have a place to return. You step over the threshold of the boarding house, the damp wood groaning under your heavy boots as the cold harbor wind follows you inside. The air in the narrow hallway hits you immediately, a thick blend of stale ale, wet wool, and the unmistakable metallic tang of the whale oil lamp sputtering on the walls. Water drips from the hem of your coat, forming a small, dark pool on floorboards that have been worn smooth by countless desperate travelers before you. You pull your collar up against the lingering draft, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation bleeding through the thin plaster walls. A distant maritime bell tolls somewhere near the docks, its hollow chime swallowed quickly by the growing roar of the evening crowds. You breathe in the harsh scent of the 1847 city, feeling the exhaustion of a long journey settle into your aching joints. Shadows cling to the corners of the front room, masking the grimy floorboards and the heavily patched curtains attempting to block the street. A massive mastiff named Brutus occupies the only dry patch near the hearth, his large head resting on massive paws as he snores with the force of a small engine. Dust motes dance in the fractured light spilling from the single window, swirling every time the front door shudders against its iron hinges. The heat from the struggling fire barely reaches the center of the room, leaving the outer edges trapped in a perpetual biting chill. Footsteps echo loudly from the floor above, the rhythmic thud of heavy work boots pacing a path across the ceiling timbers. This is the reality of the district, a place constructed from sheet timber and sheer necessity, offering shelter to those who can afford nothing better. You reach into your pocket, your fingers brushing against the few cold coins that represent the last of your weekly wages. The madam materializes from the gloom behind the serving counter, her sharp eyes calculating your worth before you even open your mouth to speak. You observe the heavy ring of iron keys dangling from her waist, clinking rhythmically against the stiff dark fabric of her bombazine dress. She offers no smile, only a worn ledger pushed across the scarred wooden surface and the silent expectation of payment in advance. You set 2 coins onto the counter, the copper striking the wood with a dull thud that seems too loud in the sudden hush of the room. She sweeps the money away in a single, practiced motion, nodding briefly toward a narrow staircase that disappears into the gloom of the second floor. You grip the banister, the wood slick with years of unwashed hands and spilled lamp oil, and begin the steep climb upward. Every step complains under your weight, a chorus of squeaks and groans that announces your progression to anyone bothering to listen. You pause on the landing, catching your breath as the temperature drops noticeably, the meager heat of the downstairs hearth unable to penetrate this high. The corridor stretches ahead, lined with mismatched doors that all look identical in the meager light cast by a single, sputtering sconce. You read the faded numbers painted roughly on the wood, searching for the room assigned to you for the coming night. A sudden burst of laughter erupts from the room at the far end, harsh and brief, before cutting off into an uneasy silence. Smoke from the downstairs kitchen drifts upward through the floorboards, carrying the burnt, greasy scent of a stew that has been boiling for far too many days. The walls themselves seem to sweat in the cold, beads of condensation forming on the cracked plaster and running down in erratic dark trails. A rat scurries along the baseboard, its claws clicking faintly against the wood before it vanishes into a familiar hole near the wainscoting. The ambient noise of the building is a constant churning ocean of overlapping lives, voices murmuring through thin partitions, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dropped bowls. Cold air presses through unseen gaps in the architecture, finding the back of the neck and the bare skin at the wrists. Survival here depends on ignoring the discomfort, focusing only on the promise of a flat surface to lay a weary head. You push open the door to your assigned quarters, the hinges shrieking a protest that makes you wince in the cramped space. The room is little more than a closet, dominated by a straw-stuffed mattress resting directly on the uneven floorboards. You drop your meager satchel in the corner, the canvas sagging lifelessly against the peeling floral wallpaper that must have been fashionable a decade ago. The window is barely a foot wide, the glass thick with harbor grime offering a distorted view of the neighboring brick wall. You test the mattress with the toe of your boot, hearing the dry rustle of old straw and sensing the inevitable lumps that will make rest a challenge. The solitary blanket folded at the foot of the bed is thin, rough spun wool, holding the lingering odor of the previous occupant's stale tobacco. You unlace your boots, your stiff fingers struggling with the mud-caked leather strings that have frozen solid during your walk from the docks. The relief of pulling the heavy footwear off is immediate, a rush of cold air hitting your damp wool socks as you stretch your cramped toes. You sit on the edge of the mattress, the straw groaning loudly in protest, and lean your back against the freezing plaster wall. The chaotic symphony of the boarding house continues around you, an endless loop of heavy footsteps, slamming doors, and muted arguments. You trace the intricate frost patterns beginning to form on the inside of the small window pane, the delicate crystals catching the faint light from the alley below. This small, rented space feels like a fragile island in the middle of a ruthless, unforgiving 19th century city. A battered wash basin sits on a small wooden crate near the door, its porcelain surface spider-webbed with dark cracks and chipped at the rim. The water inside the matching pitcher is already forming a thin skin of ice, indicating just how far the temperature will drop before dawn. Beside the basin rests a tiny, irregular nub of soap, smelling faintly of lye and rendering the prospect of washing a miserable necessity. The single tallow candle provided by the madam sits in a rusted iron holder, the wick charred and bent from previous use. Shadows thrown by the street lamp outside crawl across the ceiling, shifting and stretching as horse-drawn carriages rattle past on the cobblestones below. The room offers nothing in the way of comfort, only the raw, fundamental elements required to survive another freezing night. You wrap the scratchy wool blanket tightly around your shoulders, shivering as the damp material leaches the last bit of heat from your core. Your eyes scan the dim corners of the room, looking for any sign of the vermin that inevitably share these cheap accommodations. You listen to the relentless ticking of a clock coming from the adjacent room, the mechanical rhythm providing a strange anchor in the chaotic environment. Hunger twists in your stomach, a sharp reminder that the meager portion of bread and cheese you consumed at midday was insufficient for the labor performed. You contemplate venturing back downstairs for a bowl of the house stew, weighing the cost of another coin against the desperate need for sustenance. The cold ultimately makes the decision for you. Convincing your tired muscles to remain huddled beneath the inadequate cover, you press your hands together, blowing warm air into your cupped palms in a futile attempt to thaw your numb fingers. The sound of rain returns, a sudden fierce drumming against the roof tiles that threatens to drown out the internal noises of the building. You watch a new leak form near the center of the ceiling, a single fat drop of water gathering before falling to strike the floorboards with a hollow plink. You slide the wash basin over with your foot, positioning it carefully beneath the drip to save the wood from further rot. The rhythmic splashing of the leak becomes a new layer in the room's auditory landscape, competing with the ticking clock and the distant snoring. You pull your knees up to your chest, tucking yourself into the smallest possible shape to conserve whatever bodily warmth remains. Downstairs, the volume of the common room swells as the evening crowd reaches its peak. Shouts of boisterous laughter mix with the harsh, sharp tones of a heated dispute, the sounds traveling easily up the central stairwell. The madam's authoritative voice cuts through the din, a commanding bark that momentarily silences the argument before the general murmur resumes. The heavy front door opens and slams shut repeatedly, each instant sending a fresh gust of freezing wind howling through the drafty corridors. The mastiff lets out a deep, warning bark, likely reacting to a particularly aggressive patron or a stray animal daring to approach the stoop. It is the soundtrack of a desperate community, an entire social ecosystem fighting to endure the long, punishing winter night. You lean your head against the peeling wallpaper, letting the accumulated exhaustion of the 1847 workday wash over your aching muscles like a heavy tide. Your mind wanders back to the harbor, the endless loading of crates, the sting of the salt spray, the shouting of the foreman. You force the memories away, focusing instead on the immediate reality of the scratchy blanket and the rhythmic dripping of the roof leak. You rub your gritty eyes, feeling the coal dust that has settled into the creases of your skin despite your attempts to wipe it away. The smell of the room is overpowering, a stagnant cocktail of mildew, stale sweat, and the pungent lye soap resting near the basin. You realize that enduring this freezing space will require every ounce of mental fortitude you possess as the temperature continues its relentless draught. You decide to brave the journey to the wash basin, desperate to scrub the worst of the day's grime from your hands and face. You crack the thin layer of ice in the pitcher with your knuckles, wincing as the freezing water splashes over your wrists. You gather a meager lather from the lye soap, the harsh chemical burning the small cuts and abrasions covering your knuckles. The water in the basin turns black instantly, a testament to the brutal physical labor required to earn the coins in your pocket. You dry your skin with a threadbare towel hanging from a nail, the rough fabric doing little to warm the frozen flesh. You hurry back to the straw mattress, shivering violently as the damp air hits your freshly washed skin. An hour passes in a slow, agonizing crawl of plunging temperatures and restless shifting on the noisy straw pallet. The noise from the street outside gradually shifts from the clatter of commercial wagons to the erratic, unsteady footsteps of departing tavern patrons. The rain transitions into a heavy sleet, the ice crystals ticking sharply against the window glass like thousands of tiny, drone pebbles. Inside the boarding house, the slamming of doors becomes less frequent, replaced by the unified chorus of heavy snoring emanating from the surrounding rooms. The cold becomes a physical weight, a relentless pressure that seems to seep through the walls and settle directly into the marrow of the bones. The single tallow candle finally sputters and dies, plunging the tiny room into a total unbroken darkness. You pull the blanket tightly around your neck, attempting to trap the small cloud of warm breath escaping your lungs. You shift your weight, trying to find a position that avoids the largest, most uncomfortable lump of straw digging into your hip. You listen to the scurrying of mice inside the walls, their tiny claws scratching frantically against the lath and plaster just inches from your head. You focus on the rhythm of your own heartbeat, a rapid thumping drum that grounds you in the present moment amid the chaotic sensory inputs. The scent of the extinguished candlewick fills the confined space, the acrid smoke mingling with the existing odors of damp wool and mildew. You know the night stretches endlessly ahead, a grueling endurance test of wakefulness before the harbor calls you back to the grueling labor of the docks. You stare into the pitch-black corners of the cramped quarters, your body too wired with cold and ambient noise to find any genuine relaxation. You envision in fractured, chaotic segments the bustling docks, the heavy iron chains of the cargo cranes, the freezing spray of the harbor water. You flinch constantly, startled by a particularly loud shout from the next room or a sudden, forceful shift in the winter wind outside. You curl your fingers into tight fists, trying to keep the blood circulating as the frost creeps further across the window pane. The darkness around you feels thick and oppressive, a heavy shroud of shadows that hides the grime and the poverty, but amplifies every terrifying sound. You tell yourself that the sun will eventually rise, bringing with it the meager warmth of a winter morning and the chance to survive another day. Stillness rarely visits the sprawling 1847 tenement, but in the deepest hours of the night, a fragile temporary hush occasionally falls over the corridors. The madam has finally retreated to her own quarters, the heavy iron keys silenced as she locks away the ledger and the night's meager profits. Brutus the Mastiff has ceased his patrolling, curled into a massive, heavily breathing heap beside the cooling ashes of the common room hearth. Even the rats seem to have found their respective corners, their frantic scratching replaced by the occasional, muffled squeak from deep within the walls. This brief pause in the chaos is the only true luxury afforded to the residents, a fleeting moment of peace before the brutal machinery of the city grinds back to life. The building itself groans under the assault of the sleet, the timber frame protesting the harsh reality of the coastal winter. You carefully extend one cramped leg, grimacing as the stiff muscles protest the movement with a sharp, burning ache. You risk peeking out from beneath the wool blanket, your breath pluming in the freezing air of the darkened room. You watch the frost continue in its slow crawl across the window pane, the icy tendrils illuminated by the faint, eerie glow of the street lamp below. You try to estimate the time, judging by the quality of the silence and the depth of the cold that dawn is still several agonizing hours away. You rub your sternum, feeling the lingering tightness from hoisting heavy crates, a physical reminder of the brutal toll the harbor exacts on the body. You pull the rough fabric back over your face, retreating once more into the small, inadequate pocket of warmth to wait out the long, punishing night. The sudden crash of breaking glass from the alley below shatters the temporary quiet of the boarding house corridor. Two harsh voices immediately rise in a foul-tempered shouting match, their crude insults echoing off the brick walls of the narrow passage. The mastiff on the ground floor responds with a series of booming, vicious barks that vibrate through the floorboards beneath your mattress. Footsteps pound across the cobblestones, moving rapidly away from the establishment as one of the combatants decides to flee the altercation. The madam's heavy boots stomp across the lower hall, followed by the screech of the front door being thrown open to the winter storm. Silence eventually reclaims the street, leaving only the relentless patter of sleet and the lingering tension vibrating in the cold air. You reach out from under the scratchy cover to touch the plaster wall, feeling the icy dampness that coats the surface of the cheap material. You trace the jagged line of a long crack running vertically from the ceiling, noting how the icy draft seems to flow directly from the fissure. You pull your hand back instantly, wiping the freezing moisture onto the rough wool of your trousers. You listen as the neighboring patron resumes his thunderous snoring, the brief interruption of the alley brawl apparently forgotten in the haze of cheap liquor. You consider the fragile barrier between the chaotic violence of the 1847 streets and your own vulnerable position on the straw pallet. You tighten your grip on the thin blanket, resolving to maintain a rigid, waking vigilance until the first pale light of morning breaks. You shift your focus to the rhythmic dripping of the roof leak, using the monotonous sound to anchor your racing thoughts in the freezing darkness. You count the seconds between each drop, finding a strange, hypnotic pattern in the otherwise miserable reality of the failing architecture. You notice the pitch of the splash changing subtly, indicating the wash basin is slowly filling with the icy rainwater seeping through the shingles. You calculate the trajectory of the overflowing water, hoping the freezing puddle will not reach the edge of your meager straw mattress before dawn. You tense your abdominal muscles against the sudden shiver, the physical spasm a stark reminder of your body's desperate struggle to maintain core heat. You mentally map the route to the docks, planning your morning walk to avoid the deepest mud pits and the most notorious alleyways. The iron hinges of the room's single door rattle fiercely as a powerful gust of wind slams against the exterior of the timber building. The latch holds firm, though the rusted metal groans under the sudden immense pressure of the coastal gale. Dust sifts down from the ceiling cracks, a fine, gritty powder that settles over the blanket and the frozen water in the wash basin. The structural timbers of the boarding house creak in a continuous, agonizing chorus, sounding like the hull of an overburdened merchant ship caught in a squall. The scent of salt brine intensifies, pushed through the window gaps by the storm and masking the pervasive odor of the indoor squalor. The entire structure feels precarious, a temporary shelter clinging stubbornly to the edge of the brutal, unforgiving harbor landscape. Time moves agonizingly toward the first hints of daybreak inside the freezing tenement. The pitch of the sleet against the window pane shifts, transforming into the dull, heavy thud of wet snow piling against the fragile glass. Shadows in the cramped room begin to resolve into hard edges as a pale, bruised light bleeds through the frosted barrier. The wash basin overflows finally, the icy water spilling onto the floorboards with a steady, rhythmic slap. This is the hour when the building breathes as cold as breath, the residual heat of the previous day long vanished from the brick and timber. You stand shivering in the center of the cramped quarters, the thin blanket falling away from your shoulders and dropping to the mattress. Your stiff fingers struggle to manipulate the rigid buttons of your heavy wool coat, the fabric still holding the dampness of yesterday's labor. You stamp your feet against the uneven floorboards, attempting to force blood back into your numb toes before encasing them in the frozen leather of your boots. The laces snap under your forceful tug, forcing you to tie a clumsy knot with the frayed ends to secure the footwear. You grab your canvas satchel from the corner, the coarse material scraping harshly against your raw knuckles as you sling it over your shoulder. You pull the heavy iron latch of the door, wincing as the rusted metal protests with a sharp, echoing shriek. The hallway greets you with a wall of stagnant, freezing air, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the lingering smoke of extinguished tallow candles. You navigate the narrow corridor by trailing your hand along the peeling plaster, the surface slick with a fresh layer of condensation. The floorboards sag dangerously under your weight, warning of the advanced rot eating away at the tenement's structural beams over the decades. You pause at the top of the stairs, listening to the muffled clatter of iron pots rising from the ground floor kitchen as the boarding house stirs to life. Downstairs, the common room hums with the low, urgent murmurs of men preparing for the brutal harbor shift ahead. The hearth fire has been resurrected from the ashes, a modest blaze of split pine that spits sap onto the blackened stone. Brutus the Mastiff occupies the prime space nearest the flames, his massive tail thumping a lazy rhythm against the floorboards as the workers pass. A thick, grayish pottage boils fiercely in an iron cauldron suspended over the fire, releasing the smell of boiled turnips and salted pork fat into the crowded space. Workers huddle in tight clusters, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they share cracked ceramic mugs of weak, steaming ale. You step off the bottom stair and join the press of heavy coats and hunched shoulders moving toward the heat of the fire. Your stomach tightens at the pungent aroma of the boiling stew, the hunger from the previous evening returning with a sharp physical ache. You extend a single copper coin toward the exhausted cook, receiving a battered tin bowl filled with the watery porridge in exchange for your wages. The tin sears your cold palms, providing a fleeting burst of warmth before the winter air leaches the heat away. You swallow the gruel quickly, ignoring the gritty texture of the poorly milled grain and the questionable lumps of fat floating in the broth. You watch the madam emerge from the back room, her dark bombazine dress rustling stiffly against the wooden doorframe. She carries a heavy ledger under one arm, her sharp eyes scanning the assembled laborers with a calculating, relentless intensity. You notice the heavy ring of keys still hanging from her waist, a symbol of absolute authority in this desperate corner of the 1847 city. She issues a series of sharp commands to the kitchen staff, her voice slicing through the low din of the common room like a blade through canvas. You set your empty tin bowl on a scarred wooden table, eager to escape her scrutinizing gaze in the oppressive atmosphere of the boarding house. Outside, the city remains trapped in the twilight between night and dawn, the narrow streets buried under several inches of fresh, wet snow. A bitter wind howls off the harbor, driving the freezing precipitation horizontally into the faces of the men spilling out from the front door. The glow of the corner gas lamps creates sickly, yellow halos in the driving storm, illuminating the treacherous, icy ruts carved into the cobblestones by heavy freight wagons. The architectural silhouette of the district is jagged and chaotic. A mass of brick warehouses and sagging timber tenements pressing tightly against the narrow avenues. This is the industrial heart of the waterfront, an unforgiving landscape built exclusively around the relentless demands of maritime commerce. You lean your weight forward into the biting gale, pulling the collar of your coat up to shield your raw cheeks from the sleet. Your boots crunch loudly through the frozen crust of the snow, slipping occasionally on the slick, hidden cobblestones beneath the white layer. You fall into step behind a group of broad-shouldered stevedores, utilizing their massive forms to break the force of the oncoming wind. The scent of the harbor grows stronger with every block, a potent mixture of salt brine, rotting kelp, and the distinct metallic odor of whale oil. You taste the sea salt on your cracked lips, a constant reminder of the ocean's proximity and its dominating influence over the local economy. You hear the booming shouts of the dock bosses long before you see the massive shapes of the merchant vessels moored at the wharves. The waterfront is an explosion of frantic activity, illuminated by dozens of sputtering pitch torches and the harsh glare of oil lanterns suspended from the rigging. You navigate through a maze of towering wooden crates, heavy oak barrels, and coiled mounds of thick hemp rope scattered across the snow-covered docks. The noise is deafening, a chaotic symphony of shouting men, creaking timber, and the rhythmic, metallic clanking of heavy iron chains hoisting cargo from the deep holds. You spot the foreman for your assigned crew, his thick wool cap pulled low over his eyes as he shouts orders from atop a stack of freshly cut lumber. Colossal and dark, the merchant ship dominates the immediate horizon, a towering structure of oak and pine masts swaying gently in the turbulent harbor waters. Ice coats the intricate web of the rigging, transforming the thick ropes into hazardous frozen cables that threaten to snap under the immense strain of the wind. The wooden hull groans continuously as it grinds against the massive hip bumpers lining the edge of the stone pier. Small boats bob wildly in the chop surrounding the vessel, their crews fighting the current to secure additional mooring lines to the iron cleats. The sheer scale of the maritime operation dwarfs the laborers swarming over the decks, rendering them little more than insignificant shadows against the vastness of the ocean. You join the line of men waiting to board the icy gangplank, the wooden planks shifting precariously under the combined weight of the crew. Your turn arrives, and you grip the frozen rope handrail, hauling yourself upward against the steep incline of the temporary ramp. You step onto the main deck, the surface treacherous, with a thick layer of frozen sea spray and scattered patches of wet sawdust. The wind howls through the towering masts above, snapping the loose canvas sails with sounds resembling musket fire. You brace your legs against the rolling motion of the ship, your muscles instantly adapting to the unstable, shifting environment beneath your boots. You grip the rough edge of a massive wooden crate, the splintered pine biting through the worn leather of your gloves. Your assigned partner, A hulking man with a heavily scarred face nods briefly before you both heave against the immense weight of the cargo. You feel the strain tear through your shoulders and lower back, the physical reality of the 1847 labor demanding everything your body can give. The crate slides forward an inch, the friction screeching loudly against the frozen deck planks and vibrating through your arms. You adjust your footing, boots seeking purchase on the slippery wood, and prepare for the next grueling push toward the open cargo hatch. Morning breaks over the eastern horizon, not with warmth, but with a flat gray illumination that merely reveals the stark misery of the freezing harbor. The heavy snowfall tapers off into a fine stinging mist, blown forcefully across the water by the unbroken coastal gale. Seabirds circle the towering masts, their harsh cries cutting through the mechanical clatter of the cargo winches swinging above the deck. The massive iron hooks plunge into the dark depths of the ship's hold, emerging minutes later burdened with heavy sacks of grain and tightly bound bales of raw cotton. The breath of 50 laborers rises in a continuous, thick cloud over the main deck, a collective exhalation of pure physical exertion. You wipe a mixture of sweat and freezing mist from your brow, your chest heaving from the relentless pace set by the dock bosses. Your hands are numb, the fingers locked into rigid claws from gripping the frozen hemp ropes and jagged wooden crates for hours on end. You glance toward the shoreline, watching a line of heavy draft horses struggling to pull a loaded freight wagon through the deep, churned mud of the harbor road. You flex your aching shoulders, the joints popping audibly over the roar of the surrounding labor as you try to relieve the mounting tension. You know the shift is barely a quarter finished, the bulk of the brutal work still stretching endlessly before you in the gray morning light. You find a momentary rhythm in the grueling task, a synchronized pattern of lifting, pushing, and securing the heavy cargo alongside your partner. Your mind detaches from the immediate pain, entering a state of blank endurance necessary to survive the punishing conditions of the docks. You ignore the sharp sting of a rope burn across your palm, the minor injury insignificant against the larger canvas of the day's physical suffering. You focus solely on the rough texture of the next crate, the precise angle of leverage required, the timing of the foreman's shouted commands. You become a small mechanical component in the vast, relentless engine of the 19th century port, moving in perfect tandem with the winch and the tide. Pacing the length of the open hatch, the foreman taps a thick wooden cudgel impatiently against his heavy leather boots. His voice is hoarse from screaming over the wind, a continuous stream of profanity and harsh directives aimed at the exhausted crew working below. He points toward a tangled mass of rigging near the mainmast, demanding immediate attention to the frozen, useless ropes hampering the lifting crane. A sudden gust of wind catches an unsecured tarp, ripping the heavy canvas from its moorings with a vicious snap. The heavy fabric sails over the deck, narrowly missing a group of men wrestling a barrel of salted cod toward the wooden gangplank. You rush toward the flailing canvas, throwing your body weight onto the trailing edge before the wind can carry it over the rail and into the sea. Your boots slide dangerously on the slick deck, stopping only when your heel catches against an iron cleat bolted firmly to the timber. You haul the heavy, stiff material inward, your muscles screaming in protest as the gale fights you for control of the thick tarp. Two other laborers run to assist, their hands grabbing the coarse fabric and hauling it down to the deck with synchronized grunts of effort. You secure the brass grommets over the iron hooks, hammering them down flat with the heavy heel of your frozen boot. You feel the ship lurch heavily against the pier, a massive rogue wave striking the hull and sending a wall of freezing water over the starboard rail. The icy deluge hits you squarely in the chest, soaking through the thick wool coat and instantly chilling your skin to the bone. You gasp from the sudden, shocking impact, your hands desperately clinging to the secured tarp to prevent being swept across the slick, tilted deck. The water drains rapidly through the scuppers, leaving behind a fresh layer of dangerous, slippery ice on the wooden planks. You shake the freezing brine from your hair, your teeth chattering uncontrollably as the bitter wind hits your soaked, heavy clothing. By mid-morning, the sky remains a bruised, unbroken gray, the weak winter sun fully hidden behind layers of thick coastal clouds. The sheer volume of cargo moved from the deep holds to the waiting wagons on the pier is staggering, a testament to the raw human power driving the harbor trade. The men work in near silence now, the earlier shouts and complaints replaced by the grim, determined grunts of extreme physical fatigue. The smell of the ship is overwhelming, a pungent blend of raw cotton, cured tobacco, spilled rum, and the inescapable stench of the bilge water sloshing below decks. This is the brutal reality of the 1847 maritime industry, a punishing cycle of labor that grinds men down to the marrow. You carry a heavy sack of raw sugar across your shoulders, the coarse burlap scratching against your neck with every heavy, plodding step. Your knees buckle slightly under the crushing weight, the joints aching from hours of navigating the steep, treacherous gangplank connecting the ship to the pier. You follow the line of men off the vessel and onto the stone surface, the solid ground feeling strangely unstable after hours on the rolling, unpredictable deck. You heave the sack onto the back of a waiting freight wagon, the impact sending a small cloud of sweet-smelling dust into the damp, freezing air. You turn back toward the towering merchant vessel, the endless cycle of labor demanding your immediate return to the dark, frozen hold. You notice a group of wealthy merchants standing near the harbor master's office, their thick fur coats and pristine top hats, a stark contrast to the ragged laborers swarming the docks. They observe the massive operation from a safe distance, consulting heavy leather-bound ledgers and gesturing toward the towering piles of unloaded cargo waiting on the stones. You feel a brief, sharp flare of resentment, the stark economic divide of the era laid bare on the freezing, snow-covered pier for all to see. You suppress the emotion quickly, knowing that anger burns energy better saved for the grueling physical tasks still ahead of you. You grab a coil of heavy rope from a nearby pylon, slinging the rough hemp over your shoulder and marching back toward the icy gangplank. Surrounding the waterfront, an endless mechanical roar drowns out individual thoughts and conversations, replacing them with the pure noise of industry. Iron wheels from dozens of heavily loaded carts grind against the slick cobblestones, throwing faint sparks into the dim, misty air with every rotation. Massive draft horses snort and stamp their hooves, their thick coats steaming in the cold as they pull impossible loads toward the city's labyrinthine warehouse district. The sharp tang of burning coal drifts from the chimneys of the surrounding buildings, mixing with the ever-present stench of the harbor mud exposed by the low tide. The entire port operates like a massive, terrifying machine, consuming the sweat and muscle of thousands of men to keep the local economy alive. You trace a path through the labyrinth of stacked cargo, your eyes scanning the dark, cavernous interior of the ship's hold for the next designated load. The air down here is stagnant and surprisingly warm, insulated from the biting wind but thick with the suffocating dust of 100 different trade goods. You locate a cluster of heavy oak barrels bound with thick iron hoops, the designated target for your exhausted, overworked crew. You wedge a thick wooden pry bar beneath the edge of the nearest cask, the solid oak resisting your initial forceful push. You signal your scarred partner, preparing for the coordinated heave required to break the heavy barrel free from its tight resting place. You press your shoulder against the rough wood of the cask, your boots seeking a solid brace on the sloped, uneven floorboards of the hold. The combined effort of 3 men finally dislodges the heavy barrel, the iron hoops screeching against the deck as it rolls slowly forward toward the opening. You guide the massive object toward the open cargo net suspended from the deck above, fighting the ship's natural roll to keep the barrel on a straight, predictable path. You secure the thick ropes around the curved wood, locking the heavy iron carabiner into place with frozen, clumsy fingers. You shout the signal to the winch operator above, watching as the heavy load is forcefully jerked upward into the gray square of daylight. Without warning, a sharp crack echoes through the lower hold, the unmistakable sound of stressed timber fracturing under immense, sustained pressure. The laborers freeze instantly, their eyes darting nervously toward the massive, curved ribs of the ship's hull where the sound originated. A steady stream of dark, foul-smelling water begins to spray from a newly formed seam near the waterline, the immense weight of the ocean seeking entry into the vulnerable wooden vessel. The foreman shouts a rapid series of commands, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sharp, focused urgency directed at the immediate crisis. Men scramble for heavy wooden mallets, thick wads of oakum, and buckets of hot pitch, the daily routine abandoned to combat the sudden threat of a structural breach. You grab a handful of the fibrous oakum, the tarred hemp sticky and pungent against your raw, blistered palms. You rush toward the spraying scene, the freezing bilge water soaking your boots and trousers as you splash across the sloping, dangerous deck. You jam the thick wad of fibers into the fractured gap, the force of the incoming water immediately fighting to push the material back out into the hold. Your partner steps in beside you, wielding a heavy wooden caulking mallet with practiced, brutal precision in the cramped space. You hold the oakum steady as he drives it deep into the fractured seam, the heavy blows vibrating harshly through the wet timber and straight into your freezing hands. You smear a thick layer of scalding pitch over the newly caulked seam, the harsh chemical smell burning your nasal passages in the confined, unventilated space. The hot tar hardens almost instantly against the freezing wood, creating a solid, watertight seal over the damaged hull section. You step back, breathing heavily, watching the repair carefully for any sign of a lingering leak or further structural failure. The dark water sloshes angrily around your ankles, but the forceful spray from the ocean has been successfully halted by the rapid, coordinated intervention. You wipe your tar-stained hands on a discarded rag, the adrenaline of the emergency fading and leaving behind a heavier, crushing exhaustion in its wake. Danger momentarily past, the brutal rhythm of the cargo hold resumes without hesitation or acknowledgement of the near disaster that just occurred. The winch chains rattle down from the main deck, the heavy iron hook swinging dangerously through the dusty air before crashing heavily against the floorboards. The foreman resumes his endless pacing, his thick wooden cudgel tapping a relentless, demanding beat against the stacked crates, waiting to be moved. The air grows thicker as the morning drags on, the combination of physical exertion, stale breath, and lingering tar fumes creating a truly stifling atmosphere. The men work with heads down, their bodies moving automatically through the punishing motions, the 1847 dockyard offering no quarter or sympathy to the weary. You lift the corner of another heavy crate, the splintered wood tearing a fresh gash across the palm of your soaked leather glove. You ignore the sharp, stinging pain, utilizing the momentum of the rolling ship to swing the massive object into the waiting cargo net with a heavy grunt. Your vision blurs slightly from the continuous physical strain, the dim shapes of the hold swimming in the dusty gray light filtering down from the hatch above. You hear the distant, muffled sound of a harbor bell tolling the mid-morning hour. The ringing, a cruel reminder of how much labor still lies ahead before you can rest. You set your jaw against the bone-deep ache radiating from your spine, committing your body once more to the grueling, endless demands of the waterfront. You hear the heavy bronze bell of the harbor master's office strike the noon hour, the sound cutting through the howling wind like a dull knife. The mechanical roar of the waterfront slows just a fraction as the dock bosses blow their brass whistles, signaling a brief cessation of the grueling labor. You drop the thick hemp rope from your blistered hands, the coarse fibers leaving behind angry red welts across your palms. The freezing sleet has transitioned into an unyielding, freezing rain that coats every surface of the 1847 harbor in a layer of treacherous, transparent ice. You fall into step with the other exhausted stevedores, the entire crew moving with the stiff, mechanical gait of men pushed to their absolute physical limits. The midday break offers a meager half-hour of respite, barely enough time to seek shelter and force down a few bites of whatever sustenance can be found. Water cascades from the gutters of the towering brick warehouses, forming deep, freezing pools in the rutted cobblestone streets. You navigate the narrow alleyways leading away from the main pier, seeking the familiar refuge of a cheap dockside eating house known to the local crews. The towering brick walls block the worst of the coastal gale, creating a temporary pocket of stagnant, damp air that smells strongly of rotting fish and wet ash. Shadowy figures huddle in the recessed doorways of the merchant buildings, desperately trying to light clay pipes with numb, trembling fingers. You pull your saturated wool collar higher around your neck, the fabric heavy and stiff with frozen sea spray and accumulated grime. This brief journey through the waterfront labyrinth is a daily ritual of survival, a desperate hunt for a few moments of warmth before the afternoon shift begins. You push through the heavy oak door of the tavern, the wood warped and swollen from decades of exposure to the harbor's relentless dampness. The interior is a dense wall of heat and noise, packed tightly with dozens of laborers seeking refuge from the freezing coastal storm. Steam rises from the saturated clothing of the patrons, creating a thick, hazy fog that obscures the far corners of the low-ceilinged room. You press yourself into the crowd, the overwhelming scent of stale beer, wet wool, and cheap tobacco hitting your senses with physical force. A large iron stove dominates the center of the space, its cast iron belly glowing a dull, angry cherry red as it consumes split pine logs. You angle your body toward the radiant heat, feeling the frozen moisture in your coat begin to melt and seep deeper into your underlying garments. You examine the jagged tear across your left palm, the injury sustained earlier when the splintered edge of a sugar crate gave way under the immense pressure. The skin is raw and weeping, the mixture of salt water and coal dust, creating a sharp, constant burning sensation that throbs with your rapid heartbeat. You spot the establishment's unofficial medic, an elderly, one-eyed former sailor who trades rudimentary first aid for pints of watered-down ale. He operates from a scarred wooden table near the back of the room, surrounded by an array of stained rags, a jar of strong vinegar, and a small pot of pine pitch. You approach his station with a sense of grim resignation, knowing the treatment will likely be as punishing as the injury itself. The old man gestures toward an empty, three-legged stool, his single eye assessing the damage without a word of sympathy. You extend your trembling hand across the sticky surface of the table, bracing yourself for the inevitable sting of the crude medical supplies. He pours a generous splash of harsh, acidic vinegar directly over the open wound, the liquid foaming slightly as it mixes with the grime and blood. You bite down hard on the inside of your cheek, forcing yourself to remain silent as a wave of fiery agony washes up your forearm. The old sailor works with brutal efficiency, using a rough strip of boiled linen to scrub away the embedded splinters and coal dust. He follows the cleaning with a thick smear of the warm pine pitch, the sticky substance sealing the torn flesh and instantly blocking out the stinging harbor air. You watch as he binds the hand tightly with another strip of questionable linen, finishing the makeshift bandage with a tight, complex nautical knot. You toss a single, worn copper coin onto the table, the old man sweeping it away with the dexterity that belies his advanced age. The throbbing in your palm is changed from a sharp biting pain to a heavy localized ache wrapped in the suffocating heat of the pitch. You flex your fingers experimentally, the stiff linen restricting your movement but providing a necessary layer of protection against the rough hemp ropes awaiting your return. The tavern crowd shifts around you, a relentless sea of shoving shoulders and loud, boastful complaints about the day's backbreaking labor. You notice a group of Irish immigrants clustered near the front window, their hushed, rapid conversation drowned out by the boisterous laughter of the older dockhands. This chaotic, crowded environment is the only sanctuary available, a temporary haven from the unforgiving machinery of the 1847 waterfront. You make your way toward the serving counter, the line of exhausted men shuffling forward with their cracked tin bowls extended like beggars. The proprietor stands behind a massive steaming cauldron, wielding a long wooden ladle with the precise, practiced motions of a man determined to stretch his supplies. The midday offering is a thin gray broth containing unrecognizable root vegetables and the occasional, tough morsel of salted mutton. You exchange your last remaining coin for a meager portion, the hot tin searing your unbandaged hand as you carry it away from the chaotic serving area. You find a small patch of open wall near the glowing iron stove, leaning your tired back against the warm brick as you survey the murky contents of your bowl. The aroma is a confusing blend of old grease and boiled cabbage, a far cry from a proper meal, but a necessary fuel for the afternoon shift. You raise the tin bowl to your cracked lips, the first swallow of the hot broth sending a welcome streak of warmth down your shivering throat. The liquid is gritty, tasting heavily of salt and the lingering metallic tang of the iron cauldron it was boiled in. You use a hardened crust of yesterday's bread to wipe the bottom of the bowl, chewing the dense stale wheat mechanically until it softens enough to swallow. A sudden argument erupts near the bar, two soot-covered coal heavers trading harsh insults over a spilled mug of cheap, dark ale. You ignore the rising tension, focusing solely on scraping the last few calories from your tin, aware that the dock bosses will be blowing their whistles soon. The warmth of the food settles heavily in your empty stomach, providing a brief, deceptive illusion of comfort in the midst of the grueling workday. Voices rise and fall around you, carrying the swift, unreliable currents of harbor gossip through the thick, smoke-filled air of the tavern. You overhear a pair of sailors discussing a clipper ship that limped into port at dawn, its rigging shredded by a rogue storm off the treacherous northern coast. Another man claims the harbor master is cracking down on smuggled tobacco, pointing a calloused finger toward the window as if the authorities are already marching down the cobblestones. The rumors act as a vital currency among the laborers, trading stories and half-truths to break the monotonous reality of their punishing existence. You listen quietly, absorbing the information while maintaining a stoic, detached expression, knowing that getting involved in waterfront politics is a dangerous and foolish endeavor. The tales of disaster and petty crime swirl around the glowing stove, painting a vivid picture of a city built on risk, exploitation, and constant struggle. You look down at your soaked leather boots, noticing the frayed, broken lace dangling uselessly across the muddy, scuffed vamp. The temporary knot you tied at dawn has come undone, the stiff leathered tongue threatening to let the freezing slush seep directly into your wool socks. You pull a spare piece of waxed twine from the deep pocket of your coat, the rough string, a salvaged treasure found on the docks days ago. You bend awkwardly, the cramped space making the simple task of relacing the footwear a frustrating, complicated maneuver. Your bandaged hand lacks its usual dexterity, the stiff linen catching on the brass eyelets as you force the thick twine through the narrow openings. You pull the makeshift lace tight, the wax gripping the leather firmly and securing the boot against the inevitable return to the icy harbor mud. A sudden shout cuts through the low din of the tavern, a broad-shouldered stevedore roaring about a missing tobacco pouch. He accuses the man standing nearest to him, a scrawny youth who immediately denies the charge with frantic, fearful gestures. You watch the confrontation escalate, the surrounding crowd stepping back to form a small, tense circle around the two men. Theft is a constant nagging threat in these crowded spaces, where exhausted laborers easily lose track of their meager possessions in the chaotic crush of bodies. You instinctively press your hand against your own coat pocket, confirming the presence of your small folded knife and the empty void where your coins used to be. The proprietor intervenes before blows can be struck, wielding a heavy wooden bung mallet with enough authority to send the scrawny youth scurrying out into the freezing rain. The harsh, shrill blast of a brass whistle sounds from the street outside, a piercing note that instantly deflates the temporary comfort of the warm tavern. The laborers groan in collective unison, the brief half-hour of midday rest evaporating as quickly as it began. You swallow the last cold mouthful of your watery broth, setting the empty tin bowl on a stack of wooden crates near the door. You pull your saturated wool collar back up around your neck, bracing your body for the physical shock of leaving the heated room. The mass exodus begins, a dragging, reluctant shuffle of exhausted men pushing back out into the teeth of the coastal storm. You join the grim procession, the brief illusion of sanctuary shattered by the relentless, demanding reality of the harbor docks. You step across the threshold and back into the freezing alleyway, the drop in temperature hitting your damp clothing like a physical blow. The unyielding rain has washed away the morning snow, transforming the cobblestone streets into a treacherous, ankle-deep river of freezing mud and animal waste. You fall back into step with your assigned crew, the men moving with a heavy, leaden silence that speaks volumes about the collective dread of the afternoon shift. The towering masts of the merchant ships loom ahead in the gray, bruised light, their intricate webs of rigging looking like elaborate frozen spider webs against the sky. You flex your bandaged hand, the pine pitch-hardened into a stiff, protective shell that pulls uncomfortably at your skin with every movement. The colossal machinery of the waterfront awaits, a sprawling monster of iron and timber demanding its daily tribute of human sweat. You arrive back at the designated pier, the vast piles of unloaded cargo looking identical to the mountains you left behind at noon. The foreman is already shouting, his hoarse voice cracking as he points his wooden cudgel toward a long line of waiting, empty freight wagons. Your task shifts from the dark hold of the ship to the slippery, exposed surface of the stone wharf, moving heavy crates of manufactured goods from the staging area to the transport carts. You grab the iron handles of a weighty wooden box, your scarred partner taking the opposite side with a synchronized, heavy grunt. You heave the crate upward, your boots sliding dangerously in the freezing muck as you struggle to find traction on the wet granite blocks. The physical repetition begins again, a mindless, punishing cycle of lifting, carrying, and stacking that blurs the passage of time. Colossal draft horses strain against their leather harnesses, their iron-shod hooves throwing up chunks of freezing mud as they struggle to pull the loaded wagons away from the pier. The drivers crack long leather whips over the animals' broad backs, the sharp reports echoing like pistol shots across the busy harbor. You watch a particularly burdened cart slide sideways in the deep ruts, the wooden wheels groaning under the immense lateral pressure. You and several other laborers drop your current cargo, rushing over to press your shoulders against the tilted bed of the wagon to prevent it from overturning. The combined strength of men and horses eventually rights the precarious vehicle, sending it lurching forward into the maze of the warehouse district. You wipe a splatter of foul-smelling mud from your cheek, returning immediately to your own endless pile of waiting crates. The weak winter sun begins its gradual descent toward the western horizon, the gray sky darkening perceptibly as the afternoon wears on. The cold intensifies with a fading light, the freezing rain transitioning back into a sharp, stinging sleet that coats the docks in a fresh layer of dangerous ice. You feel a deep, burning ache settle into the base of your spine, a persistent, throbbing pain that radiates down your legs with every heavy step. You ignore the exhaustion, knowing that any display of weakness will draw the immediate, harsh attention of the pacing dock bosses. You focus solely on the rough texture of the wooden handles, the slick surface of the cobblestones, and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the man working beside you. This is the ultimate test of endurance, a brutal marathon designed to weed out the frail and break the strong. A deep, resonant horn blast echoes across the turbulent water, signaling the arrival of another immense merchant vessel seeking entry into the crowded port. You pause for a brief second, watching the colossal ship cut through the gray swells, its dark hull battered and scarred by the unforgiving ocean. Dozens of small tugboats swarm around the giant vessel, their steam engines chugging loudly as they guide the massive structure toward an open slip. The sheer scale of the global trade network is staggering, a continuous, relentless flow of goods and raw materials passing through this freezing, miserable choke point. You tighten your grip on the cargo, the momentary distraction broken by the sharp crack of the foreman's cudgel striking a nearby barrel. The harbor never stops, a perpetual motion machine that grinds forward regardless of the weather, the hour, or the suffering of the men who keep it running. You lift your head to check the position of the fading light, calculating the remaining hours of daylight and the corresponding end of the grueling shift. The sleet has plastered your hair to your forehead, the freezing water running down your neck and soaking the collar of your rough wool shirt. You feel the bandage on your hand slipping slightly, the harsh friction of the crates wearing away the sticky pine pitch applied earlier. You adjust the linen strip with your teeth, pulling the knot tight before grabbing the next heavy load waiting on the stone pier. The air is thick with the smell of wet horses, burning coal, and the ubiquitous, inescapable scent of the salty harbor brine. You push through the mounting physical agony, drawing on hidden reserves of stamina to maintain the brutal pace demanded by the relentless waterfront. Shadows lengthen across the freezing docks, stretching out from the towering piles of cargo like dark, grasping fingers. The activity on the pier reaches a frantic, desperate peak, the foreman pushing the crews to clear the remaining staging areas before the total darkness sets in. You heave a heavy sack of raw wool onto the back of the final wagon, the dense material absorbing the sleet and doubling in weight. Your arms tremble uncontrollably as you release the load, the muscles utterly depleted of energy after 10 solid hours of unbroken, back-breaking labor. You stand back as the wagon driver snaps his reins, the horses pulling the heavy cart away and leaving a small, empty patch of wet stone in its wake. The immediate area around your crew is finally clear, a temporary victory against the endless incoming tide of global commerce. The harbor master's bell tolls again, a series of sharp, commanding rings that signal the official conclusion of the daylight shift. The dock bosses lower their wooden cudgels, their hoarse voices finally falling silent as they gather to tally the daily manifests. You drop your hands to your sides, the sudden absence of heavy labor leaving your body feeling strangely weightless and unsteady. The men around you slump against the wooden pilings, their chests heaving as they suck the freezing, sleet-filled air into their burning lungs. You look out over the dark, churning water of the harbor, the rolling swells reflecting the sickly yellow light of the newly lit gas lamps. The day's brutal work is finished, leaving behind only the crushing exhaustion and the daunting prospect of finding warmth before the long 1847 winter night truly begins. You join the mass of exhausted laborers shuffling away from the piers, the transition from grueling work to brief respite marked by the lighting of the street lamps. The gas fixtures flicker to life along the harbor road, casting a sickly greenish-yellow illumination across the freezing mud and the rutted cobblestones. The wind has lost none of its bitter edge, tearing through the narrow alleys and driving the sharp sleet horizontally into the faces of the retreating men. You pull your collar higher around your raw neck, feeling the frozen wool chafe against the irritated skin with every stiff, heavy step. The mechanical roar of the waterfront gradually fades behind you, replaced by the chaotic overlapping noises of the crowded tenement district preparing for the long winter evening. Shadows lengthen in the narrow spaces between the towering brick warehouses, hiding the worst of the urban decay beneath a veil of early darkness. Stray dogs scurry along the gutter lines, their ribs showing prominently beneath matted fur as they scavenge for scraps among the frozen refuse. The stench of the 1847 city is inescapable here, a potent cocktail of raw sewage, burning cheap coal, and the ever-present salty rot of the nearby ocean tide. Wagons rattle past with reckless speed, their iron-shod wheels throwing up fans of freezing slush that splatter against the shins of the walking dockhands. Survival in this environment requires a constant weary vigilance, a perpetual awareness of the immediate physical hazards lurking in the gloom. You approach the familiar, sagging facade of the boarding house, the warped wooden door already propped open to accommodate the steady influx of returning workers. The heat hitting you at the threshold is instantaneous and suffocating, a thick wall of humid, stagnant air that smells intensely of wet wool and unwashed bodies. You step inside the chaotic common room, the sudden change in temperature causing your lungs to spasm in a brief, painful coughing fit. The floorboards are coated in a slick layer of tracking mud, making the simple act of walking toward the hearth a treacherous balancing act. You spot the massive Mastiff Brutus sprawled directly in the center of the main pathway, forcing every exhausted man to navigate awkwardly around his snoring form. Behind the scarred serving counter, the madam commands the room with an iron posture and a gaze that misses nothing. Her dark bombazine dress absorbs the meager light of the sputtering whale oil lamps, making her appear as a solid, formidable shadow against the peeling plaster wall. She holds a thick, leather-bound ledger open before her, a sharpened quill pen poised over the yellowed pages to record the nightly extraction of wages. A heavy iron lockbox sits securely at her elbow, the metal surface gleaming faintly every time a fresh copper coin is deposited into its dark interior. Her authority is unquestioned in this space, maintained through a combination of sheer intimidation and the universal understanding that she controls the only available shelter. You step up to the wooden counter, your frozen fingers fumbling awkwardly inside the deep pocket of your coat to retrieve your daily earnings. You place 3 copper coins onto the scratched surface, the metal clinking softly against the wood as you settle your debt for the night's lodging and a single meal. She sweeps the money away with a practiced fluid motion, marking a sharp black line next to a smeared name in her book without bothering to look up. You move aside quickly, making room for the next shivering laborer in line, desperate to escape the immediate radius of her intense, calculating scrutiny. The transaction is cold and efficient, stripping away any illusion of hospitality and reinforcing the stark, transactional nature of your continued existence in her establishment. A colossal cast iron cauldron dominates the roaring hearth fire, bubbling fiercely and emitting a thick, greasy steam that coats the ceiling timbers in a dark residue. The house cook, a broad-shouldered woman with forearms thick from years of manual labor, wields a long wooden paddle to stir the murky gray pottage. The concoction is a chaotic blend of cheap root vegetables, hardened barley, and whatever questionable cuts of meat the local butcher discarded at the end of the day. The smell is overpowering, a pungent aroma of boiled cabbage and old fat that somehow manages to cut through the pervasive odor of the unwashed crowd. Hungry men cluster tightly around the heat source, their cracked tin bowls extended in a silent, desperate plea for a generous portion. You claim your serving of the boiling stew, the heat transferring instantly through the thin tin bowl and burning the raw skin of your palms. You retreat to a narrow section of unoccupied wall near the back hallway, sliding down until your aching spine rests against the solid brickwork. You bring the rim of the bowl to your cracked lips, swallowing the scalding, gritty broth without pausing to register the lack of recognizable flavor. A chunk of tough, stringy mutton provides a brief, demanding challenge for your teeth, requiring several minutes of concentrated chewing before it can be safely swallowed. You scrape the bottom of the tin with your fingernail, ensuring that not a single calorie of the meager meal is left behind in the metal curb. The atmosphere within the boarding house begins a subtle, distinct shift as the evening progresses and the last remnants of daylight vanish from the frosted window panes. The desperate exhaustion of the returning dockhands slowly yields to the manic, unpredictable energy of the city's nocturnal inhabitants emerging from their daytime slumber. A group of women wearing brightly colored, heavily patched dresses descend the creaking stairs, their cheap floral perfume waging a losing battle against the scent of the boiled stew. The volume of the room swells considerably, transitioning from the low grumbles of tired men to the shrill, forced laughter of forced socialization. This is the beginning of the night shift, a period where the establishment operates less as a sanctuary and more as a chaotic, unregulated tavern. You watch the changing dynamic with a detached, weary gaze, your body too depleted of energy to participate or even care about the unfolding spectacle. You observe a traveling merchant attempting to corner one of the women near the hearth, his boastful claims about his imported goods falling on deaf, practiced ears. You feel the heavy, oppressive weight of the crowded room pressing in on you, the sheer volume of humanity, making the air feel thin and difficult to breathe. You pull your knees up to your chest, resting your forehead against the damp wool of your trousers in an effort to block out the overwhelming sensory input. The wooden floorboards vibrate continuously against your boots, transmitting the heavy, rhythmic stomping of a drunken jig starting near the front door. Brutus the Mastiff finally wakes from his long slumber, his enormous head rising slowly as he surveys the escalating chaos of the common room. He lets out a low, rumbling growl that reverberates in the chests of the men standing nearest to him, a clear warning to a patron who has stumbled too close to his resting spot. The dog serves as the establishment's primary enforcer, a hulking mass of muscle and teeth that requires no wages and accepts bribes only in the form of discarded meat bones. The unruly patron quickly backs away, his drunken bravado evaporating instantly under the unblinking, hostile stare of the massive canine. The dog lowers his head back to his paws, satisfied that his dominance over that particular patch of floorboard remains uncontested. You inspect the makeshift bandage wrapping your left hand, noting how the pine pitch has hardened into a rigid, uncomfortable shell over the torn flesh. You flex your fingers, a sharp lance of pain shooting up your forearm as the stiff linen pulls against the irritated, inflamed edges of the wound. You know the risk of infection is a constant, terrifying reality in this unsanitary environment where a simple scratch can easily lead to a lost limb or a fatal fever. You tuck the injured hand safely inside the front of your coat, protecting it from accidental bumps in the shoving, unpredictable crowd pressing around you. The throbbing serves as a continuous, rhythmic reminder of the dockyard's brutality, a pain that will follow you into the dark and linger long after the shift ends. Snippets of waterfront gossip drift through the hazy, smoke-filled air, carrying tales of sunken ships, fluctuating cargo prices, and the petty tyrannies of the harbor foreman. Two coal heavers argue fiercely over a game of cracked bone dice, their harsh, accented voices cutting through the background noise with escalating agitation. A young sailor attempts to strum a battered wooden lute in the corner, the off-key plucking providing a disjointed, chaotic soundtrack to the unfolding scene. The madam watches it all from her position behind the counter, her expression remaining an unreadable mask of cold calculation as she monitors the flow of the room. She tolerates the noise and the minor scuffles, intervening only when the potential for property damage threatens her bottom line. You notice a sudden bizarre movement near the base of the serving counter, your exhausted brain struggling to process the shape pushing through the dense crowd of legs. You realize with a jolt of absurd disbelief that an adult goat is casually wandering through the common room, its coarse gray coat matted with dried mud and straw. You watch the animal casually chew on the dangling hem of a merchant's expensive broadcloth coat, the man oblivious to the destruction happening below his waist. You feel a strange, bubbling urge to laugh at the sheer, chaotic madness of the scene, a testament to the unregulated, lawless nature of the 1847 boarding house. The goat spits out the tough fabric and ambles toward the hearth, seeking the warmth of the fire with the arrogant entitlement of a paying guest. The presence of livestock inside the building surprises no one, just another accepted bizarre reality of an establishment that operates by its own unique set of rules. The animal is a notorious thief, known for snatching unattended bread crusts from tables and destroying any laundry left hanging too low on the indoor lines. The cook swats at the beast with her wooden paddle as it approaches the boiling cauldron, a daily skirmish that the goat usually wins through sheer stubborn persistence. It settles eventually near the snoring mastiff, the two mismatched animals forming an uneasy, temporary truce in their shared pursuit of the radiant heat. The bizarre menagerie adds another layer of unpredictable movement to a room already bursting at the seams with restless, desperate humanity. You decide the meager comfort of the heated room is no longer worth the sensory assault of the noise, the smell, and the constant shoving proximity of the other patrons. You push yourself up from the floor, your stiff joints popping loudly as they bear the weight of your exhausted frame once again. You navigate the obstacle course of the common room, stepping carefully over outstretched legs, spilled ale, and the unpredictable path of the wandering goat. You reach the base of the narrow staircase, gripping the slick wooden banister as you prepare for the grueling ascent to the freezing second floor. The prospect of the icy, solitary room suddenly seems like a luxurious retreat compared to the suffocating, chaotic circus playing out behind you. The stairwell acts as a dark, freezing tunnel, funneling the bitter draft from the upper floors down to meet the rising heat of the common area. The timber steps groan in a chorus of high-pitched squeaks and heavy structural thuds under the heavy tread of ascending boots. Shadows stretch and distort along the peeling plaster walls, cast by the single sputtering oil lamp mounted precariously on the first landing. The air grows noticeably thinner and sharper with every upward step, stripping away the thick humidity of the stew and replacing it with the scent of raw, biting winter. This vertical journey marks the final transition of the laborer's day, a grueling climb away from the communal struggle and into the solitary endurance of the night. You arrive at the door of your assigned quarters, your breath coming in short, visible plumes in the freezing corridor air. You lean your weight against the warped wood, forcing the swollen door open with a harsh scrape against the uneven floorboards. You step into the familiar, pitch-black space, the immediate drop in temperature, biting through your damp coat and settling straight into your bones. You feel your way through the darkness toward the straw mattress, your boots kicking aside the empty wash basin left near the center of the small room. You collapse onto the rustling straw, not bothering to remove your boots or your heavy outer layers, lacking the energy for even the simplest acts of undressing. The window panes rattle violently as the coastal gale renews its assault on the harbor, driving a fresh wave of sleet against the fragile glass. The delicate frost patterns from the previous night have thickened considerably, forming a solid, opaque barrier of ice that blocks out even the faint glow of the street lamps. The boarding house settles into its nocturnal rhythm, the vibrations of the music downstairs traveling up through the floor joists like a steady, muted heartbeat. The real trend, this cold reclaims its dominion over the upper floors, freezing the condensation on the walls and turning the breath of the resting men into tiny clouds of ice. The building exists as a fragile, shivering shell against the overwhelming power of the 1847 winter storm. You pull the thin, scratchy blanket over your head, creating a small, suffocating pocket of air in an attempt to conserve your core body heat. You listen to the frantic scratching of a mouse in the wall directly behind your head, the tiny claws seeking a way into the room to escape the freezing temperatures outside. You find yourself hoping the small creature succeeds, craving even the most insignificant spark of life in this dark, freezing tomb of a room. You close your heavy eyelids, the darkness behind them offering no relief from the vivid, lingering images of the swinging cargo hooks and the brutal dock bosses. You maintain a rigid, waking vigilance against the plunging temperature, surrendering your stiff muscles to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the long hours ahead. The hours stretch forward in an unbroken continuum of shivering misery, marked only by the periodic striking of the distant harbor bell. The raucous noise from the common room eventually begins to fade, replaced by the unified rumbling snores of dozens of men crammed into the adjacent rooms. The harsh reality of the waterfront dictates that rest is merely a brief, mandatory pause required before the endless cycle of labor begins anew at dawn. The iron grip of the frost tightens its hold on the city, encasing the docks, the ships, and the towering warehouses in a thick layer of unyielding ice. The night demands absolute endurance from every soul trapped within its freezing embrace, offering no comfort and accepting no surrender. The freezing water from the ceiling leak finally breaches the rusted wash basin, spilling over the rim to saturate the uneven floorboards. You feel the icy dampness spread rapidly through the loose straw of your mattress, instantly neutralizing any meager body heat you had managed to generate. You push yourself up from the ruined bedding, your muscles screaming in protest against the sudden, forced movement in the frigid air. You realize that remaining in the soaked clothing on a freezing wet pallet will inevitably lead to a fatal lung fever before dawn. You grab your heavy canvas satchel and sling it over your shoulder, abandoning the tiny flooded room out of pure, desperate necessity. You step back out into the pitch-black corridor, the timber structure groaning around you as the gale continues to batter the harbor. Shadows in the narrow hallway offer no solace, shifting erratically as a powerful draft blows through the cracks in the exterior plaster. The oppressive cold of the second floor feels even more severe now that your core temperature has plummeted, forcing harsh shivers through your exhausted frame. A sudden, sharp crack sounds from the floor above, followed by the heavy thud of an object striking the wooden boards. The noise provides a brief distraction from your immediate misery, hinting at other restless souls awake in the sprawling, dilapidated tenement. Surviving the remainder of the night requires finding a dry corner, however small, within the massive, freezing labyrinth of the boarding house. You ascend the final, steepest flight of stairs leading to the attic level, the wooden steps bowing precariously beneath the soles of your heavy boots. You reach the top landing and discover a faint, orange glow emanating from beneath a poorly fitted door at the end of the hall. You approach the source of the light cautiously, your frozen fingers trailing along the damp, peeling wallpaper to maintain your balance in the gloom. You hear the low murmur of voices exchanging hushed, urgent tales, the words swallowed by the howling wind outside the eaves. You push the warped door open just enough to slip inside, desperate for any marginal increase in temperature the occupied space might offer. You step into a sprawling, low-ceiling storage space repurposed as a makeshift gathering area for the building's chronic insomniacs. You notice a rusted iron brazier resting on a square of fireproof brick in the center, containing a meager handful of glowing coal embers. You move instinctively toward the heat source, extending your trembling hands over the iron rim alongside 3 other haggard, exhausted laborers. You recognize one of the men as a fellow dock worker from your afternoon crew, his face streaked with soot and heavily lined with chronic fatigue. You claim a space on a discarded wooden crate, pulling your damn coat tightly around your chest and leaning toward the glowing coals. The atmosphere in the attic is thick with the smell of burning coal dust and the unwashed wool of the men huddled around the brazier. An elderly sailor, missing 3 fingers on his left hand, leans forward, tossing a single, small piece of scavenged driftwood onto the dying embers. The wood sparks immediately, releasing a sharp, salty aroma that mixes with the stale air of the confined, low-ceilinged room. He speaks in a gravelly, hushed tone, recounting a local waterfront legend about a merchant ship that vanished off the coast over 50 years ago. The other men listen with rapt, silent attention, eager for any narrative that distracts them from their own physical suffering and the relentless cold. You listen to the old sailor describe the doomed vessel, his words weaving a dark tapestry of treacherous shoals and arrogant, foolish captains. You watch the flickering orange light play across the faces of your companions, illuminating the dark hollows beneath their exhausted, bloodshot eyes. You feel the isolation of the 1847 winter pressing against the slate roof just inches above your head, making the old man's story of maritime disaster feel terrifyingly plausible. You rub the stiff pine pitch on your bandaged hand, the localized pain, a stark contrast to the numbing cold affecting the rest of your extremities. You realize these late-night storytelling sessions serve as a vital psychological defense mechanism, a collective effort to ward off the crushing despair of the environment. You turn your attention to a younger man sitting opposite the brazier, watching him attempt to mend the large tear in his rough canvas trousers. You observe his clumsy, freezing fingers struggling to manipulate a rusted iron needle through the thick, unyielding fabric. You reach into your coat pocket and retrieve the remaining length of waxed twine you used earlier to secure your broken bootlace. You offer the sturdy string to the struggling youth, placing the salvaged material silently on the rim of the iron brazier between you. You receive a brief, solemn nod of gratitude in exchange, a silent acknowledgement of the shared, desperate poverty binding everyone in the tenement together. The wind outside reaches a new, terrifying pitch, shrieking through the wooden eaves with a force that threatens to tear the slate tiles from the roof. The entire attic shudders fiercely, prompting the men to cast nervous, upward glances at the sagging timber joists supporting the ceiling. A sudden massive leak erupts in the far corner of the space, a stream of freezing rainwater pouring directly onto a stack of abandoned shipping crates. The relentless intrusion of the elements is a constant, exhausting battle, requiring the residents to adapt their meager shelters constantly to avoid the incoming water. Nobody moves to address the new structural failure, the combined fatigue of the group rendering them apathetic to anything outside the immediate radius of the coal fire. You calculate the hours remaining before the harbor master's bell will demand your return to the brutal labor of the cargo holds. You know the meager heat from the brazier is insufficient to dry your soaked clothing, but it prevents the moisture from freezing solid against your skin. You listen to the old sailor transition into another grim tale, this one involving a phantom cargo wagon that supposedly haunts the cobblestones of the warehouse district. You find the rhythmic cadence of his voice strangely anchoring, a continuous human sound pushing back against the chaotic mechanical roar of the winter gale. You stare into the glowing heart of the coal embers, letting your mind detach from the immediate, overwhelming physical misery of your surroundings. You notice a sudden commotion near the attic door, the warped wood banging loudly against the frame as a frantic figure bursts into the room. You recognize the scrawny youth from the downstairs tavern, the one previously accused of stealing a dockhand's tobacco pouch during the midday break. You watch him scramble toward the darkest corner of the storage space, his eyes wide with genuine panic and his chest heaving with exertion. You immediately check the location of your own canvas satchel, pulling the heavy strap closer to your boot to ensure your few possessions remain secure. You understand that the tenement operates on a brutal, unforgiving hierarchy, and the boy has clearly angered someone higher up the chaotic social ladder. Heavy, aggressive footsteps thunder up the final staircase, announcing the imminent arrival of the youth's angry pursuers. A broad-shouldered coal heaver steps through the doorway, his massive fists clenched and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unchecked rage. The air in the attic instantly thickens with tension, the fragile peace of the gathering shattered by the sudden influx of hostility. The older men around the brazier remain seated, their expressions carefully neutral, refusing to involve themselves in a dispute that does not directly concern their own survival. The unspoken rule of the district dictates that every man must fight his own battles, relying on no one else for protection or intervention. You watch the coal heaver drag the terrified youth from the shadows, his heavy hand gripping the boy's ragged collar with effortless, brutal strength. You see a small leather coin purse fall from the boy's pocket, hitting the wooden floorboards with a heavy, metallic clink, confirming his guilt. You feel a surge of cold pragmatism replace any initial sympathy. Recognizing that thievery within the boarding house is a crime threatening the survival of every resident, you remain perfectly still on your wooden crate, your eyes fixed on the glowing coals, actively removing yourself from the unfolding violence. You know that intervening would only redirect the larger man's fury towards yourself, a risk you cannot afford with a wounded hand and an exhausted body. You observe the brief, vicious beating with detached resignation, the harsh reality of waterfront justice playing out inches from the iron brazier. You see the coal heaver retrieve his stolen purse, delivering one final, punishing kick to the ribs of the downed youth before turning back toward the door. You listen to the heavy footsteps recede down the staircase, the violent interruption concluding as quickly and brutally as it began. You watch the battered boy curl into a tight ball on the freezing floorboards, his muffled sobs ignored by the other men sharing the attic space. You focus your attention back on the old sailor, silently urging him to resume his ghost stories and restore the previous fragile equilibrium of the room. The elderly storyteller clears his throat, spitting a dark wad of phlegm into the corner before seamlessly picking up the thread of his interrupted narrative. The tale shifts to a legendary, massive, stray dog that supposedly prowls the docks at midnight, acting as a grim harbinger for sailors destined to drown. The flickering light from the dying coals casts long, distorted shadows across the ceiling, making the fantastical story feel eerily present in the drafty, miserable space. The ambient temperature continues to drop as the meager fuel supply dwindles, the iron sides of the brazier losing their dull red glow and returning to cold black metal. Enduring the remainder of the night will require tapping into the very last hidden reserves of human stamina and mental fortitude. You stand up from the wooden crate, your joints screaming in protest after remaining stationary in the freezing air for too long. You know the coals will be extinguished within the hour, leaving the attic just as leapily cold as the flooded room you abandoned earlier. You sling your canvas satchel over your shoulder, checking the knot on your makeshift bootlace one final time before turning toward the warped door. You leave the huddled group of men behind, stepping back into the pitch-black corridor to resume your endless, desperate search for a survivable corner of the tenement. You navigate the treacherous, creaking stairs entirely by touch, your hands sliding along the peeling plaster wall as you descend back into the heart of the building. The descent brings the familiar stench of the overflowing communal privies, hitting your senses with a fresh, nauseating wave. You hear the deep, resonant snoring of the exhausted laborers radiating from every closed door, a massive chorus of survival playing out in the dark. You test the floorboards carefully with the toe of your boot, avoiding the sections of timber you know to be rotted through by decades of water damage. You spot a small, recessed alcove near the end of the hall, a space barely large enough to accommodate a single person sitting upright. You move toward the narrow niche, desperate to claim the minor shelter before another wandering, freezing resident discovers its existence. The alcove offers a marginal reprieve from the aggressive drafts tearing down the main corridor, acting as a tiny, inadequate windbreak against the coastal gale. Dust and cobwebs coat the corners of the recess, the accumulated grime of the 1847 boarding house thick enough to scrape away with a fingernail. A single, rusted iron pipe runs vertically through the back wall of the niche, emitting a faint, metallic groan every time the wind strikes the roof above. This pipe provides no heat, serving only as an acoustic conduit transmitting the chaotic noises of the ground floor directly into the cramped space. The blackness of the hallway feels heavy and oppressive, a physical weight threatening to crush the spirit long before the cold stops the heart. You wedge your body into the tight space, pulling your knees tightly against your chest and wrapping your heavy wool coat around your legs. You lean your head against the freezing plaster, the hard surface offering no comfort but providing a solid anchor in the disorienting darkness. You force your breathing into a shallow, measured rhythm, attempting to minimize the amount of icy air entering your raw, burning lungs. You feel the constant dull throbbing of your bandaged hand pulsing in time with your heartbeat. The pine pitch hardened into a tight, restrictive cast. You retreat inward, constructing a mental fortress against the overwhelming, punishing reality of the tenement hallway. You inventory the aches and pains scattered across your exhausted frame, cataloging the toll the cargo holds have extracted from your muscles and joints. You feel a deep, burning cramp developing in your right calf, a direct result of pushing heavy crates across the slippery, frozen deck of the merchant ship. You massage the hardened muscle with your good hand, your numb fingers digging forcefully into the stiff wool of your trousers to relieve the agonizing tension. You know that displaying any physical weakness tomorrow will result in immediate dismissal by the ruthless dock bosses, leaving you to starve in the winter streets. You compel your body to relax, forcing the cramped muscle to release its tight, painful knot through sheer, stubborn willpower. The distant harbor bell tolls again, the hollow, metallic sound cutting cleanly through the howling wind and vibrating through the walls of the tenement. The relentless march of time offers no solace, pushing the city ever closer to the grueling demands of the impending dawn. The temperature reaches its absolute lowest point, the freezing air settling heavily into the lower levels of the building and turning any spilled water into solid, treacherous ice. The frantic scratching of vermin inside the plaster intensifies, the rats and mice driven to desperate measures to escape the lethal cold penetrating the timber frame. Surviving this darkest phase of the night requires a thorough dissociation from the physical agony of the present moment. You press your ear against the rusted iron pipe running vertically through the back wall of the narrow alcove. The cold metal transmits a continuous, low-frequency hum originating from far within the tenement's brick foundation. It sounds exactly like the collective groaning of the heavy timber framing as the frost strikes further into the structural wooden joints. You feel the faint rhythmic vibrations traveling through the flaky iron oxide and directly into your jawbone. This mechanical heartbeat provides a strange grounding tether to the physical structure surrounding your cramped, freezing refuge. The storm outside seems to catch its breath momentarily, allowing the internal settling of the boarding house to echo clearly down the pitch-black corridor. You shift your weight slightly on the wooden floorboards, trying to redistribute the pressure on your bruised hips without exposing your legs to the seeking draft. You slip your uninjured right hand deep into the lined pocket of your heavy wool coat. Your numb fingers locate the smooth, polished bone handle of your folding pocket knife, resting at the bottom of the rough fabric. You trace the familiar brass rivets set securely into the handle, using the distinct tactile sensation to anchor your wandering, exhausted mind. The metal bolsters are freezing to the touch, matching the ambient temperature of the unheated hallway perfectly. You run your thumb along the closed steel backspring, feeling the microscopic scratches and sharp dents accumulated over years of brutal labor on the harbor docks. This small, mundane object represents one of the few tangible possessions linking you to the harsh reality of the 1847 waterfront. You keep your grip tight around the cold handle, finding a minor measure of security in the solid weight resting against your thigh. The air trapped inside the narrow niche carries a complex, layered history of the building's enduring squalor. You identify the sharp, acrid bite of old ammonia rising from the warped floorboards, a lingering testament to countless spilled chamber pots over the decades. Beneath that harsh surface odor lies the musty, organic scent of decaying horsehair plaster, an ancient, untreated dry rot. You take shallow, measured breaths through your nose, attempting to filter the worst of the foul atmosphere before it reaches your burning lungs. The severe cold suppresses the strongest stenches, freezing the ambient dampness that usually amplifies the tenement's foulest odors during the summer months. You tilt your head back against the wall, allowing the chill to numb the tip of your nose and dull your remaining olfactory senses. The atmospheric landscape of the corridor stands as a harsh reminder of the relentless poverty shared by every soul locked within these walls. A faint rhythmic tapping reaches your ears from the cobblestone street far below the sagging boarding house. You recognize the heavy, measured tread of the city watchman making his mandatory solitary circuit through the treacherous harbor district. His iron-shod walking stick strikes the frozen mud with a dull, hollow thud that penetrates the thick timber walls of the building. You visualize the solitary figure bundled in heavy broadcloth, holding a shielded brass lantern against the biting coastal gale. The sound offers a fleeting, distant connection to the organized civic machinery operating outside the lawless boundaries of the tenement. You track the progression of the tapping as it moves slowly past the front entrance and fades into the labyrinth of the neighboring alleyways. The brief intrusion of authority vanishes quickly, abandoning the waterfront to its own brutal, unregulated devices once again. You pull your injured left hand from the protective warmth of your coat to inspect a makeshift tavern dressing. The pine pitch applied earlier has hardened fully, forming a stiff, unforgiving cast over your raw, torn palm. You flex your fingers a fraction of an inch, testing the limits of the rigid linen binding before the sharp pain flares across your knuckles. The throbbing ache pulses in direct synchronization with your rapid heartbeat, sending hot spikes of discomfort up your stiff forearm. You gently massage your wrist with your right thumb, attempting to encourage blood flow without disturbing the sealed, sticky wound. You know that preserving the integrity of this crude bandage is an absolute necessity for retaining your employment on the cargo ships tomorrow. You tuck the hand carefully back inside your coat, returning it to the dark, insulated pocket near your chest. The ambient temperature within the hallway experiences another distinct, sudden plunge as the deepest phase of the night takes hold. You feel the residual heat stripped wholly from your damp wool garments, leaving the heavy fabric feeling like a layer of crushed ice against your bare skin. You clench your jaw tightly to prevent your teeth from chattering, fearful that the loud clicking will attract unwanted attention from the neighboring rooms. The plaster wall behind your back transforms into a solid block of freezing stone, stealing warmth directly from your spine and hunched shoulders. You draw your knees higher, compacting your physical form into the smallest possible target for the fierce, seeking draft slicing down the corridor. Enduring this specific, brutal drop in the mercury requires a total psychological detachment from the physical reality of the cramped alcove. A low, ragged coughing fit erupts from the room directly across the narrow corridor from your hiding space. You listen to the wet, congested sound tearing through the thin wooden door, followed by a harsh, scraping gasp for air. The afflicted laborer mutters a string of incoherent, feverish syllables before collapsing into another prolonged spasm of deep, rattling coughs. You recognize the unmistakable auditory signature of the harbor lung, a lethal affliction born from breathing coal dust, freezing fog, and stagnant tenement air. You remain perfectly still in your alcove, offering no assistance to the suffering stranger trapped in the adjacent darkness. The brutal economics of the waterfront dictate that sickness is a solitary burden, a fatal weakness leading swiftly to starvation and immediate eviction. The coughing eventually subsides into a ragged, uneven wheeze that blends into the chaotic background noise of the structure. You strain your eyes in the pitch-black space, noticing a faint, metallic sheen forming on the wall directly opposite your niche. You realize the severe cold is drawing moisture from the humid corridor air and freezing it directly onto the peeling, faded wallpaper. You reach out with your right hand, brushing your fingertips lightly against the icy accumulation covering the damaged floral pattern. The frost feels coarse and granular, possessing the exact texture of the raw sugar you hauled from the merchant ship's hold hours earlier. You withdraw your hand quickly, wiping the icy residue onto your trouser leg to prevent your fingers from losing their remaining tactile sensation. The visual confirmation of the indoor frost underscores the lethal potential of the 1847 winter gripping the harbor. The boarding house provides a mere illusion of shelter, offering only a marginal, failing barrier against the true ferocity of the coastal storm. Hallucinations begin to flicker at the extreme edges of your vision, a direct consequence of prolonged exposure and severe physical depletion. You watch the dark shapes in the hallway twist and elongate, interpreting the shifting shadows as moving figures patrolling the creaking floorboards. You blink rapidly, forcing your eyes to focus on the solid vertical line of the rusted pipe to banish the deceptive dancing images. The mental strain of maintaining the rigid, waking state begins to equal the heavy physical agony radiating through your abused muscles. You pinch the skin on the back of your hand, using the sharp, immediate sting to pull your wandering mind back to the present reality. You know, that's the real trend, and the crushing weight of exhaustion in this freezing alcove would be a fatal, irreversible mistake. You anchor your thoughts entirely on the mechanical necessity of drawing the next freezing breath. The violent howling of the wind outside the slate roof gradually loses its sharp, piercing edge. You notice the rattling of the distant window frames becoming less frantic, the intervals of silence between the heavy gusts stretching longer and wider. The storm is finally exhausting its initial fury, transitioning from a driving gale into a steady, bitter coastal freeze. You hear the heavy timber frame of the tenement settle with a prolonged, agonizing groan as the lateral pressure of the wind decreases. The reduction in the chaotic external noise amplifies the internal soundtrack of the building, bringing the scratching vermin and the snoring laborers into sharper, distinct focus. You recognize this subtle atmospheric shift as the precursor to the pre-dawn hours, the final stagnant stretch of the long winter ordeal. You brace your back against the icy plaster, preparing for the creeping, silent cold that inevitably follows the turbulent weather. You summon a vivid tactile memory of the blacksmith's forge located near the primary cargo wharves to combat the paralyzing chill. You visualize the massive stone hearth, the roaring column of orange flame, and the intense, blistering heat radiating from the glowing iron ingots. You imagine holding your frozen hands near the roaring leather bellows, feeling the phantom warmth melting the ice from your knuckles and soothing the raw skin. You construct the sensory details with deliberate, painstaking care, using the mental projection as a psychological shield against the plunging temperatures of the hallway. The smell of hot metal, the rhythmic ringing of the heavy hammer, the sight of the flying sparks all serve to anchor your focus away from the alcove. This internal fabrication provides a vital, necessary distraction, a mental sanctuary constructed purely from raw willpower and desperate necessity. You cling to the illusion of the roaring forge, letting it sustain your fragile grip on conscious endurance. An oppressive, heavy stillness settles over the entire boarding house as the deepest hour of the night takes full, absolute command. The frantic scurrying of the rats ceases entirely, the vermin retreating deep into the central walls to huddle near the chimney flues for survival. Even the chronic coughing from the adjacent room fades into a silent, ominous quiet that feels thicker than the darkness itself. You sit motionless in the narrow niche, your breathing slowed to a shallow, barely perceptible rhythm to conserve vital energy. The cold is no longer a biting force. It has become a solid, heavy blanket draped over every inch of your body. You feel the isolation of the waterfront district pressing down on the tenement, 1,000 desperate souls trapped individually within their freezing wooden cells. You wait in the crushing silence, a solitary sentinel enduring the brutal transition between the death of the night and the birth of the morning. You track the microscopic creeping of the frost along the surface of the rusted iron pipe beside your shoulder. The metal emits a low, resonant ping that vibrates faintly against the damp plaster of the alcove wall. This subtle acoustic shift signals a further drop in the ambient temperature, a final, punishing plunge before the sun can offer any theoretical relief. You feel the dense wool of your coat stiffen into a rigid shell, the iced fibers locking together to form an unyielding carapace against the draft. The hallway remains entombed in darkness, but the quality of the shadows seems to thicken, adopting the stagnant, leaden texture of deep water. You take a shallow breath through your nose, the frigid air burning a clean, stinging path down the back of your throat. Endurance in this final, suspended hour demands a complete surrender to the physical misery, a willing acceptance of the biting chill as a temporary, unavoidable state of being. You press the knuckles of your uninjured right hand against your cheek, seeking a localized spark of friction to confirm your own physical boundary. The skin feels like roughly cured leather, stripped of all natural oils by the harsh salt wind and the relentless sleet of the previous day. You drag your fingers downward, tracing the coarse, untrimmed stubble along your jawline, the bristly hairs coated in a fine, powdery layer of crystallized breath. The physical sensation is dull and distant, as if you are touching the face of a stranger, carved from cold stone rather than your own living flesh. You curl your toes inside the stiff leather boots, the localized movement sending a delayed, sluggish signal of discomfort up your aching calves. The chill has penetrated the thickest layers of your defenses, establishing a permanent icy residence deep within the marrow of your bones. Deep within the structural core of the boarding house, a massive oak support beam groans under the accumulating weight of the rooftop snow. The prolonged, agonizing creak travels outward through the floor joists, a wooden complaint that underscores the fragility of the 1847 waterfront architecture. The sound momentarily breaks the oppressive silence of the corridor, providing a brief acoustic distraction from the overwhelming sensation of the cold. The structure itself seems to be fighting a losing battle against the elements, shrinking and contracting in a desperate attempt to minimize its exposure to the gale. Dust sifts down from the ceiling plaster in a fine, invisible cascade, settling lightly over the shoulders of your frozen coat. This slow, continuous decay is the natural rhythm of the tenement district, an environment that consumes timber and brick just as readily as it consumes human labor. You shift your focus to the throbbing sensation isolated within your bandaged left palm, using the localized pain as a crude internal metronome. The pine pitch applied by the old sailor has hardened into a dark, inflexible shell, effectively sealing the torn flesh from the unsanitary air of the hallway. You feel a distinct, rhythmic pulling against the edges of the wound with every beat of your heart, a stark reminder of the physical damage sustained on the cargo docks. You know that preserving the integrity of this crude dressing is paramount, a necessary measure to prevent the aggressive infections that routinely claim the limbs of careless laborers. You cradle the injured hand against your abdomen, attempting to shield the sensitive nerves from the ambient bitter draft circulating through the alcove. The discomfort is a persistent companion, a tangible consequence of the brutal commerce that defines your existence in this unforgiving harbor city. Stagnant odors gather in the recessed pocket of the niche, trapped by the shifting air currents of the larger corridor. A faint, residual smell of extinguished coal dust drifts down from the attic level, carrying the metallic tang of the dying brazier you abandoned earlier. This harsh scent mingles with the pervasive, underlying stench of damp rot and the sour aroma of unwashed wool permeating the entire timber structure. The glacial temperatures suppress the volatility of these foul smells, muting their intensity, but failing to eradicate their grim presence entirely. You force yourself to ignore the grim olfactory landscape, recognizing it as an inescapable feature of the impoverished urban environment. The air you breathe is a shared, contaminated resource, recycled to the lungs of 100 desperate strangers seeking shelter beneath the same sagging roof. You project your thoughts forward to the impending reality of the morning shift, a deliberate mental exercise designed to prepare your exhausted body for the coming ordeal. You visualize the treacherous descent down the icy gangplank, the crushing weight of the oak barrels, and the relentless, screaming commands of the dockyard foreman. You mentally rehearse the specific physical postures required to lift the heavy crates without causing further catastrophic damage to your already strained lumbar spine. This grim anticipation serves as a psychological armor, a necessary hardening of the will before stepping back into the brutal machinery of the 19th century port. You know that any hesitation or display of weakness upon returning to the wharves will result in immediate termination, a swift sentence to starvation on the winter streets. You lock your jaw against the encroaching despair, committing yourself entirely to the stoic, unbroken endurance demanded by the waterfront. You detect a faint, rhythmic scratching emanating from the space between the interior lath and the exterior brickwork directly behind your resting head. The desperate sound belongs to a solitary rat seeking a path toward the residual warmth of the central chimney flues, its tiny claws tearing uselessly at the frozen mortar. You find a dark, grim solidarity with the struggling vermin, recognizing a shared primal instinct to survive the lethal cold gripping the harbor district. The scratching continues for several long minutes, a frantic, isolated struggle that eventually fades into the heavy, overwhelming silence of the pre-dawn hour. You adjust your posture slightly to relieve the numb pressure on your tailbone, the minor movement causing your frozen joints to pop with a loud, startling crack. The sudden noise feels deafening in the stagnant quiet, a harsh reminder of your own physical presence in the dark, cramped hallway. Outside the frosted window panes of the distant rooms, the coastal storm finally begins to break its suffocating hold on the sleeping city. The violent, horizontal sleet transitions into a sparse, drifting snowfall, the large flakes spiraling silently toward the frozen mud of the narrow alleyways. The wind drops from a shrieking gale to a low, mournful moan, a sustained acoustic shift that alters the entire atmospheric pressure of the tenement. The reduction in external chaos makes the internal stillness of the boarding house feel even more profound, a suspended silence that precedes the inevitable waking of the labor force. The dark hours have stretched the limits of human endurance, extracting a severe toll from the muscles and minds of the men trapped within the timber walls. The impending daybreak offers no promise of comfort, merely a transition from the static agony of the freezing night to the active, punishing torment of the cargo docks. You listen intently for the first unmistakable sounds of the city's commercial awakening, your ears straining against the leaden silence of the corridor. A distant, muffled thud echoes from the direction of the commercial bakeries several blocks away, the heavy iron oven doors slamming shut as the early fires are stoked. You feel a sudden, sharp pang of intense hunger twist through your hollow stomach, a harsh, physiological response to the mere thought of baking bread. You press your right forearm hard against your abdomen, attempting to physically suppress the gnawing ache with steady, applied pressure. You know the meager morning ration of watered gruel provided by the madam will do little to satisfy the caloric deficit incurred by yesterday's brutal labor. You force the distracting thoughts of food from your mind, focusing instead on the steady, rhythmic condensation forming and freezing on the rusted iron pipe. You uncross your stiff ankles, the leather of your boots grinding together with an abrasive scrape that echoes briefly in the tight alcove. The lack of circulation has rendered your feet into twin blocks of unfeeling wood, a dangerous numbness that masks the potential onset of permanent frost damage. You begin a slow, agonizing process of wheedling your trapped toes, forcing the sluggish blood back into the extremities through sheer mechanical effort. The returning sensation is not warmth, but a brilliant, agonizing burning that shoots sharply up your calves. You endure the localized torment without making a sound, knowing the painful revival of the nerves is a necessary, vital step before bearing your own weight again. The physical maintenance of your exhausted body requires constant, painful vigilance in the face of the unyielding winter temperatures. Faint, gray illumination begins to outline the warped frames of the doors lining the long, narrow corridor, a barely perceptible shift in the absolute darkness. This initial, weak manifestation of the morning light holds no warmth, acting merely as a cold, revealing wash that exposes the filthy reality of the tenement walls. The peeling floral wallpaper emerges from the gloom, the water-stained patterns looking like bruised, rotting flesh in the dim, pre-dawn atmosphere. The shadows retreating from the corners seem reluctant to relinquish their hold on the building, clinging stubbornly to the uneven floorboards and the recessed alcoves. This is the bleakest, most demoralizing hour of the 24-hour cycle, a period where the illusion of nighttime sanctuary is stripped away to reveal the grim, waiting demands of the 1847 workday. The visual reality of the slum confirms the inescapable poverty that defines this coastal existence. You recognize the subtle shift in the lighting as your undeniable cue to abandon the temporary freezing shelter of the hallway niche. You place your uninjured right hand flat against the icy plaster wall, using the solid surface to brace your exhausted frame as you force yourself upward. Your knees pop loudly, the frozen synovial fluid resisting the sudden mechanical demand of bearing your full body weight. You stand swaying slightly in the narrow corridor, your head spinning from the sudden change in elevation and the severe, prolonged lack of caloric intake. You lean heavily against the wall for several long seconds, allowing your equilibrium to stabilize before attempting to navigate the treacherous, uneven floorboards. The simple act of standing upright constitutes a major physical victory, a triumph of stubborn endurance over the paralyzing forces of the winter night. You hear the first, definitive sounds of the boarding house returning to its chaotic, waking state. A slow, grudging resurrection from the dark. A deep series of coughs erupts from a room near the staircase, followed by the distinct, metallic scrape of a flint striking steel as a laborer attempts to light a tallow candle. You detect the faint, rhythmic creaking of the floor joists as dozens of men begin to shift their weight on the rustling straw mattresses, their bodies protesting the imminent return to the docks. The harsh, commanding voice of the madam drifts up from the ground floor, a muffled bark ordering the exhausted cook to revive the bank kitchen fires. The sprawling machinery of the tenement is grinding back into motion, a brutal, synchronized engine fueled entirely by the desperate need for daily wages. Heavy boots hit the floorboards in the adjacent room with a dull, resonant thud that vibrates through the thin plaster partition. The sound acts as a definitive starting gun for the morning routine, prompting a cascading sequence of groans, curses, and shuffling footsteps down the length of the hall. The isolated, silent endurance of the night is officially concluded, replaced by the communal misery of men preparing to face the freezing harbor. The scent of cheap, harsh tobacco begins to filter through the cracks beneath the doors, a pungent morning ritual designed to suppress hunger and dull the senses before the labor begins. The corridor rapidly loses its identity as a dark sanctuary, transforming back into a busy, heavily trafficked thoroughfare, connecting the resting quarters to the brutal reality of the outside world. You adjust the heavy canvas satchel slung across your shoulder, the coarse strap biting sharply into the bruised, tender muscle near your collarbone. You take a slow, deliberate step forward, your stiff legs moving with a mechanical, jarring awkwardness that sends shockwaves of pain up your spine. You trail your right hand along the wall for balance, your fingers ghosting over the freezing condensation as you navigate the dim, gray gloom of the hallway. You fix your eyes on the top of the stairwell, the dark rectangular opening representing the unavoidable threshold between the grim shelter of the boarding house and the lethal demands of the 1847 waterfront. You force your frozen features into a mask of stoic, unreadable endurance, mentally locking away the agony of the night to face the punishing, relentless reality of the coming day. You brace your shoulder against the heavy timber frame of the stairwell, preparing to descend into the chaotic common room below. A sudden, unfamiliar sequence of chimes rings out from the harbor master's office. A rapid double strike that cuts cleanly through the lingering winter fog. Heavy footsteps surrounding you hesitate instantly, the exhausted men pausing on the groaning stairs to decipher the meaning of the unexpected signal. Voices shout upward from the ground floor, carrying the impossible news that a solid sheet of pack ice has locked the merchant slips overnight. Gangplanks and rigging are rendered impassable, coated in a thick, lethal layer of frozen sea spray that prevents any cargo from moving safely. The brutal machinery of the 1847 waterfront has been forced into a mandatory, grinding halt by the fierce coastal freeze. You let out a trembling breath, the realization of a suspended shift washing over your bruised muscles like a phantom warmth. Releasing your death grip on the wooden banister, you feel the overwhelming tension begin to drain from your rigid shoulders. The atmosphere in the corridor shifts in a fraction of a second, the grim determination of the labor force dissolving into a collective, stunned relief. Men turn back toward their cramped quarters, their movements losing the frantic, driven edge of the typical morning routine. You reverse your own course, dragging your heavy boots across the peeling floorboards toward the freezing room abandoned hours ago. The prospect of returning to the straw mattress no longer feels like a desperate survival tactic, but a rare luxury granted by the frozen harbor. You push the walk door open, the rusted iron hinges shrieking loudly in the suspended stillness of the tenement hallway. Gray illumination fills the tiny room, revealing the harsh, unfiltered reality of the bruised winter morning. You step carefully over the threshold, your eyes immediately drawn to the overflowing wash basin and the puddle of solid ice covering the floorboards. Freezing water from the ceiling leak has fully crystallized, forming a treacherous, slick surface that reflects the dull light from the frosted window. You navigate around the frozen hazard, moving methodically toward the corner where the straw pallet rests against the damp, peeling wallpaper. The thin wool blanket lies exactly where you left it, a rumpled, stiff heap holding the memory of the night's earlier miseries. You sink down onto the edge of the mattress, the dry straw protesting loudly under the sudden, dropping weight of your exhausted frame. You begin the arduous process of removing your stiff, mud-caked boots, your numb fingers fumbling with the frozen leather laces. Wedging the heel of your right foot against the toe of the left, you pry the heavy footwear off with a series of sharp, stubborn jerks. Sudden exposure to the freezing air sends a fresh wave of stinging pain through your toes, a sharp reminder of the ambient temperature. You strip away the damp, heavy wool coat, the thick fabric retaining the pungent, salty odor of the cargo holds and the harbor muck. You drape the garment over the small wooden crate near the wall, the stiffened arms hanging down like the limbs of a discarded, frozen scarecrow. You peel off your saturated socks, the coarse yarn leaving red impressions across the swollen skin of your arches. Stretching out fully against the noisy straw, you pull the rough wool blanket up to your chin to trap the last remnants of your body heat. You stretch your legs out straight, a resonant pop echoing from your left knee as the joint finally releases its tightly wound tension. The raw, burning ache in your lower back begins to spread outward, dulling into a heavy, pervasive soreness that anchors you firmly to the mattress. You press the back of your head against the hard floorboards beneath the straw, staring up at the intricate network of water stains mapping the cracked ceiling plaster. You trace the jagged lines with your eyes, finding strange, abstract shapes in the decaying architecture of the 1847 boarding house. The profound stillness of the room contrasts sharply with the frantic, mechanical roar that typically dominates this hour on the waterfront. Downstairs, the noise of the common room settles into a muted, subdued hum, the frantic energy of the morning departure replaced by a lethargic calm. You hear the distant clatter of a tin cup striking a wooden table, the sound isolated and distinct in the absence of the usual shouting. The cook banks the main hearth fire, shoveling heavy layers of gray ash over the glowing pine logs to preserve the precious fuel for the evening. The metallic scrape of the iron shovel travels up through the central chimney flue, vibrating softly against the brickwork hidden behind your plaster wall. You focus your attention on this localized rhythmic sound, allowing the measured repetition to guide your mind away from the lingering stress of the docks. The tenement breathes a collective sigh of relief. A sprawling structure of timber and brick permitted a momentary, unexpected rest. Checking the condition of your bandaged hand, you bring the injured palm close to your face in the dim, gray light. The hardened pine pitch holds fast, a dark, rigid seal protecting the torn flesh from the freezing, stagnant air of the cramped quarters. You feel a rhythmic throb deep within the knuckles, the pain manageable now that the immediate threat of heavy labor has been removed. You lower your arm slowly, resting the stiffly wrapped hand across your abdomen to shield it from accidental bumps against the rough wall. You allow your focus to drift away from the localized discomfort, actively dissolving the tight, defensive barriers your mind constructed during the night. The physical demands of the 19th century port fade into the background, leaving only the immediate sensory reality of the silent, freezing room. Outside the frosted window pane, the sparse snowfall continues to drift soundlessly over the frozen mud of the narrow alleyway. The harbor wind has died away, leaving a stagnant, heavy atmosphere that seems to muffle the usual acoustic signatures of the industrial city. You listen for the familiar rattle of the commercial wagons on the cobblestones, finding only a vast, unbroken quiet settling over the entire district. The towering brick warehouses stand like abandoned monuments in the winter fog, their massive iron doors locked tight against the unyielding ice. You realize the entire waterfront has surrendered to the elements, a rare cessation of the brutal commerce that defines the era. This suspended silence is a fragile gift, a temporary sanctuary granted by the absolute ferocity of the coastal winter. You shift your weight slightly, the dry straw beneath you moving with a rustling sound that seems abnormally loud in the hushed room. You notice the specific texture of the wool blanket pressing against the sensitive skin of your neck, the coarse fiber scratching lightly with every shallow breath. The scent of the extinguished tallow candle lingers faintly in the stagnant air, a sharp waxy aroma that mingles with the ever-present smell of damp plaster. You focus on these minute, immediate details, shutting out any thoughts of the coming days, the unpaid ledgers, or the treacherous cargo holds. You feel the crushing weight of the accumulated exhaustion begin to pull your consciousness downward, a heavy, irresistible tide drawing you toward rest. The harsh realities of the boarding house blur at the extreme edges of your vision, the peeling wallpaper fading into a uniform, shadowy gray. Within the room, the biting drafts of the night are replaced by a uniform, stagnant chill that requires no active defense. You feel your heartbeat slowing to a measured, rhythmic thud, the frantic, survival-driven pace of the dark hours finally relenting. You trace the creeping progress of a single drop of condensation sliding down the interior surface of the frosted window glass. The water leaves a clear, narrow track through the intricate ice crystals, a tiny, silent event marking the passage of the suspended morning. You close your eyes for a brief testing moment, the darkness behind your lids feeling instantly heavier and more profound than the gloom of the room. You open them again, ensuring the environment remains unchanged, a final check of your immediate, fragile sanctuary. You turn your head slightly, resting your cheek against the woven fabric of the blanket folded over the top of the mattress. The specific weave of the material presses a faint, tactile pattern into your skin, a grounding physical sensation in the otherwise sensory-deprived space. You hear the resonant sigh of the timber framing settling deeper into the stone foundation, a drawn-out groan of stressed oak and pine. You synchronize your own breathing with the agonizing sound of the architecture, matching the dragging pace of the old building. The isolation of the cramped quarters feels protective now, a necessary barrier separating your exhausted frame from the relentless world outside the heavy wooden door. The necessity of immediate action has been fully suspended, leaving only the vital process of bodily recovery. You sink deeper into the yielding straw, your heavy muscles surrendering their final stubborn knots of tension to the flat surface. The cold floorboards beneath the mattress provide a solid, unmoving foundation, a stark contrast to the rolling, treacherous decks of the merchant ships. You let the memories of the frozen rigging and the shouting foremen dissolve, refusing to carry the trauma of the docks into the sanctuary of sleep. You focus solely on the precise sound of a single, loose shingle rattling faintly against the slate roof far above your head. The noise is small, rhythmic, and benign, an acoustic anchor in the vast, quiet expanse of the frozen city. You feel the last, lingering traces of adrenaline evaporate from your bloodstream, replaced by a numbing lethargy that spreads slowly from your core to your extremities. Drawing a measured breath, you taste the metallic tang of the frozen wash basin water lingering in the stagnant air. The icy puddle on the floorboards cracks sharply, a sudden loud fissure forming as the structural temperature of the room continues to settle. You listen to the microscopic brittle sound of the ice expanding, a natural, unstoppable process that mirrors the deep freeze locking the harbor in place. You notice the specific angle of the weak, gray light filtering through the frost, illuminating a single, floating speck of dust suspended motionless above your chest. The absolute stillness of the tiny particle emphasizes the profound lack of air currents in the enclosed space, a stagnant perfection that demands total, unbroken rest. You allow the leaden weight in your limbs to become the only reality that matters, a physical anchor holding you securely to the rough pallet. Over the frozen wharves, the muffled sound of a harbor gull crying out reaches your ears, a lonely, echoing note in the void. You imagine the birds circling the empty, ice-coated rigging of the massive merchant vessels, a solitary witness to the cessation of human industry. The cry fades quickly, swallowed by the immense, suppressing blanket of the winter fog rolling in off the dark, churning ocean. You bring your attention back to the immediate radius of the straw mattress, shrinking your world down to the exact dimensions of the scratchy wool cover. You feel the deliberate pulse of blood moving through the veins in your wrists, an internal rhythm marking the passage of the quiet morning. The need to remain vigilant, to guard against the predatory elements of the tenement, finally releases its iron grip on your exhausted mind. You shift your shoulders a fraction of an inch, seeking the perfect neutral alignment against the unforgiving floorboards. You hear the papery rustle of a mouse moving carefully within the lath and plaster of the opposite wall, the sound small and unthreatening. The tiny creature seems to have found its own measure of sanctuary against the cold, sharing the silent, frozen endurance of the boarding house. You note the exact texture of the dried mud clinging to the cuff of your discarded trousers, resting near the wooden crate. The rigid, caked dirt serves as a final visual reminder of the grueling physical labor you have been mercifully spared from enduring today. You let your eyelids droop, the bruised flesh resisting the effort required to remain open and alert in the dim gray light. You notice the specific hollow sound of a single ember shifting in the banked ashes of the downstairs hearth, a tiny vibration traveling through the brickwork. You feel the precise weight of the rough wool blanket pressing against your collarbone, the heavy fabric acting as a physical shield against the stagnant chill. You listen to the deep groan of the ceiling joists contracting imperceptibly in the freezing temperatures above your head. You smell the lingering trace of lye soap clinging to the damp wood of the cracked wash basin near the door. You trace the distinct, abrasive scrape of frost forming on the inside of the window glass, a microscopic creeping of ice across the pane. You allow your breathing to become shallow, matching the suspended animation of the frozen harbor district surrounding the tenement. The ambient sounds of the city have vanished, leaving a profound, unbroken quiet that feels as vast and deep as the winter ocean itself. You feel the tight defensive knots in your jaw muscles finally unclench, your teeth separating as the last vestiges of stress evaporate into the cold air. The darkness waiting at the edge of your vision begins to pull closer, a welcoming shadow that promises absolute unbroken relief from the demands of the 1847 era. You realize that this specific stolen moment of peace is the rarest commodity available on the waterfront, a treasure more valuable than the copper coins locked in the madam's iron box. You surrender to the dragging sensation pulling you downward into the center of the straw mattress. Salts and frost hang motionless in the space between your face and the coarse wool blanket. You hear the papery sound of your own eyelashes brushing against the rough fabric as you blink in the gloom. The chill in the room no longer registers as a threat, but merely as a static, unchanging condition of the secluded environment. You feel the steady rhythm of your heartbeat echoing faintly in your ears, a soothing internal drumbeat guiding you away from the waking world. The peeling floral wallpaper, the rusted iron hinges, and the cracked ceiling plaster all lose their defined edges in the fading gray light. You register the exact, brittle snap of a single straw stalk breaking under the weight of your shoulder blade. You observe the faint, dusty smell of the ancient horsehair plaster filtering down from the narrow cracks in the ceiling above. You feel the specific, cold density of the air resting heavily against the exposed skin of your forehead. You note the microscopic ticking sound of the ice expanding across the surface of the flooded wash basin. You map the slight, uneven depression in the mattress where the materials have settled under the constant pressure of exhausted bodies. You track the faint, rhythmic vibration of the wind striking the slate roof tiles far above the attic level. You smell the sharp metallic tang of the iron door latch chilling rapidly in the stagnant corridor air. You feel the distinct, heavy warp of the floorboards pressing firmly against the back of your heels. You listen to the drawing sound of the draft pulling through the narrow gaps in the window frame. The silence of the winter morning settles fully over the tiny, frost-covered room. The quiet weight of the frozen harbor presses gently against the frosted glass, holding the restless world securely at bay. You close your eyes. Rest well in this forgotten stillness. Another quiet corner of history will be waiting whenever you need to return.